America and other free and open societies face crucial challenges and opportunities abroad that affect security and prosperity at home. This is a series of conversations with guests who bring deep understanding of today's battlegrounds and creative ideas about how to compete, overcome challenges, capitalize on opportunities, and secure a better future. I am H.R. McMaster. This is Battlegrounds.
On today's episode of Battlegrounds, our focus is on Canada, the United States ally, neighbor, and third largest trade partner with which it shares the longest undefended border in the world. Our guest today is His Excellency David MacNaughton, the Canadian ambassador to the United States from 2016 to 2019. Prior to his ambassadorship, Ambassador McNaughton served as the chairman at public affairs firm Strategy Corps and as North American president of public relations consulting company Hill & Knowlton. Currently, Ambassador McNaughton is the president of Palantir Technologies, Canada. In 1604, French explorers Pierre de Monts and Samuel de Champlain established the first European settlements in modern-day Canada. The French colonists clashed with the native First Nation populations and signed a peace treaty in 1701. As the British colonies of North America became wealthier, the British and French fought for control of territory and resources, culminating in the 7 Years' War of 1756 to 1763. In 1759, in the pivotal Battle of the Plains of Abraham, the British defeated the French to gain control of French Quebec. France officially ceded the colony of Canada to Britain in the Treaty of Paris in 1763. Half a century later, an independent United States tried and failed to conquer Britain's renamed Upper and Lower Canada in the War of 1812. The British relinquished control of internal Canadian affairs in 1867 by establishing the Dominion of Canada, a federation of 4 provinces which formed the first self-governing Canadian entity. Canadian provinces and territories expanded from coast to coast and north to the Arctic late into the 20th century. Canada gained independence from the United Kingdom in 1931 and gained final legal independence with the establishment of a new constitution in 1982. Canada has long played a prominent role on the international stage. Canadians fought with courage and distinction in the world wars of the 20th century, in the Korean War, and the war in Afghanistan. Canada was a founding member of NATO in 1949 and has participated in every NATO mission since the alliance's inception. Canadians have also been at the forefront of some of the most important diplomatic and peacekeeping efforts of the Cold War and post-Cold War eras. In the 1960s, Canada passed its Bill of Rights, hosted the World's Fair, and amended previous restrictions to allow immigrants from around the world to join their nation. During Prime Minister Pierre Trudeau's time in office from 1968 to 1979 and 1980 to 1984, he expanded Canada's presence on the world stage through achieving complete independence from the British Parliament, establishing diplomatic and trade relationships with developing nations, and joining the G7, while also promoting pan-Canadian unity. In 1984, Prime Minister Brian Mulroney was elected and strove for a closer relationship between Canada and the United States. His administration helped to establish the North American Free Trade Agreement, which was renegotiated into the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement in 2019. In the aftermath of the Great Financial Crisis, Prime Minister Stephen Harper expanded Canada's trading network tenfold with 45 new trade deals, maintained the world's highest per capita immigration, and Canada emerged as the top economic performer among the G7 with an expanding middle class. The United States and Canada remain top trade and security partners. Bilateral trade reached $2 billion a day in goods and services, and nearly 400,000 people crossed the border between the countries every day in 2019. Canada is a major leader in the supply chain for critical minerals. The United States and Canada work seamlessly together on North American defense, and cooperate within international organizations to combat transnational crime and climate change. We welcome Ambassador McNaughton following the NATO summit, the G7 summit, and as North America emerges from the global pandemic.
Ambassador David MacNaughton, welcome to Battlegrounds. I just want to tell you what a pleasure it was to work with you years ago. It was one of the highlights of my brief time in Washington. Great to see you, and thanks for joining us.
Great to see you too. And I certainly enjoyed working with you. I mean, one of the things that people always ask was, what was it like working with the Trump administration? And I said, well, there were two sides to it. One was working with the president, and the other one was working with some of the great people that he'd appointed, and you were one of those. And it was a pleasure working with you.
Those were at times some contentious issues there on trade and everything else. But, as a historian, I'm reminded that we've had worse times in our history. And I'm thinking of the two failed invasions of Canada. And I would like to just begin with that topic, right, of U.S. Canada relations. We oftentimes just take for granted, right, the close relationship and our common principles and worldview. And what's your assessment, David? You worked very hard on the relationship as ambassador. You're observing it very closely now. What do you think are the greatest opportunities that we're facing in the U.S. Canada relationship, and what are the challenges that you see?
Well, I think there are quite a number of opportunities. I mean, the world has changed a lot in the last few years. I mean, the emergence of the deterioration of the U.S.-China relationship, the reemergence of a belligerent Russia, and Iran and North Korea. And, the United States and Canada have been allies for a long, long time, and we fought together. In fact, I think I mentioned to you, my grandfather was actually an American who was one of 35,000 Americans who came to Canada between 1914 and 1917 to fight with the Canadian troops in Europe before the U.S. got into the war. And those ties have been extremely close, and we fought together around the world ever since. I think that, I would say we let the relationship slip somewhat, and I think it was kind of taking each other for granted. And I think it's really important right now that we look to reestablish those ties. It doesn't mean we have to agree on everything, and there are always going to be some trade issues back and forth. But I think that our NORAD relationship in terms of the North American continent, the things that are going on in Central and South America, and particularly in Venezuela and Nicaragua and places like that. I mean, we have a real shared interest in collaboration, and I think we did take that for granted for a long time, and I'm hoping that we can rebuild it. But I'm concerned, frankly. I really am.
Yeah, we've heard a positive message on this, on strengthening the ties between democratic and like-minded nations coming out of the recent G7, the NATO summit. But of course, their obstacles remain. We have polarization in our own country, a very strong, I think, polarization along partisan political lines, social divisions that are exacerbated, I think, by social media. But of course, as you mentioned, we're also facing adversaries that are actively engaged against us and trying to widen the gaps in our society. What's your perspective on that in Canada, and it's particularly in connection with Russian political subversion and what some have called cyber-enabled information warfare against us?
Yeah, I think, obviously, this is an area and an issue which is of great concern. I mean, I think that what's happening now is that warfare isn't so much putting soldiers on a battlefield and ships, although those are still important, but it's also the technology and the sophistication of our adversaries who are trying to exacerbate divisions within our society. And as you say, what's happened in the United States is that's become really quite noticeable. It isn't quite as bad in Canada, but it's getting there. And I think, you know, I worry that Canadians haven't had as much of a realization about the threats that we face, but they're starting to. And I know that, you know, for instance, if you'd ask Canadians 4 years ago or 3 years ago about their attitudes towards China, excuse me, they would have had a fairly positive view. I mean, we do a lot of trade with China, certainly, you know, in agriculture and fisheries and things like that, and in raw materials. But if you ask Canadians today about their attitudes towards China, they'd mirror, I think, very much the attitudes of the United States. And I've often said to people that the only thing that that Republicans and Democrats seem to agree on these days is being anti-China. But I think it's, you know, we really have to figure out how to work closer together, particularly since I think, as you and I have discussed before, that a lot of the multilateral organizations that have kept the peace and prosperity since the Second World War have broken down and aren't very effective anymore, certainly not like they used to be.
Right. And I guess have to adapt to some of these new arenas of competition, the new forms of competition that operate in cyberspace, and in space as a competitive domain now. And of course, the Arctic is a geostrategic arena of competition. And so I just wondered what your view is from Canada toward the Arctic, because we've seen, you know, Russia, Denmark, and Canada have been vying for, I think, control in a competition that I think is increasingly important because of global warming and the opening up of shipping routes through the Arctic, and as well as the tremendous natural resources that are there. What do you think that about the UN Commission, the work that is ongoing on the Arctic? What do you think might result from negotiations to try to resolve some of the elements of that competition?
Yeah, I mean, I think that on the disputes that we have with Denmark, I mean, there's one island that's under, you know, a contentious one as to whether we own it or they own it, and there's some disagreements with the United States in terms of, you know, passage through the Northwest Passage and things like that. Those are relatively, I mean, they've been going on for a long time, but we've all agreed that those are the kinds of things that should be settled through international dispute resolution and negotiation. The Russians don't play that game, and as we've seen over the last few years, they have been increasing their military presence in the Arctic and encroaching even further. And I think that Canadians have become more and more aware of that, and I think there's huge support for both, you know, defending our sovereignty there, but also the issues around the environment, around Indigenous people. You know, you know, for us, it's a very kind of an emotional attachment to the Arctic, even for those who haven't spent a lot of time up there. So I think you're going to see a lot more Canadian activity up there in terms of both the defense and also trying to build alliances with our friends to make sure that people like the Russians and even the Chinese are starting to, you know, talk about you know, passage through the waters and all these kinds of things. And the economic potential up there is huge. So it's going to become an area of significant contention in the next few years, for sure.
You know what I think is interesting is really how each of these challenges are interconnected, right? There's a security challenge in the Arctic that's related to energy security, and
yes,
those energy security issues are connected to the competition with Russia, obviously. And I wonder if you talk more about how you see just the interconnection between really economic policy, trade policy, and security policy, maybe using, you know, energy as an example, right? I'm just thinking about how, you know, the Biden administration has canceled the Keystone pipeline, but given Russia a free pass on Nord Stream 2, for example, right?
Yeah.
Which I don't really understand, which then I think probably forces Canada to sell more of its oil to China, right? Which gives China more economic leverage over Canada. That can't be good. So how do you see the connection between, and we've had conversations about this in the past, right? Between economic and trade policy and security policy?
Well, first of all, I am not a climate change denier or any of that. I mean, I believe that we need to be doing things. I think it's an existential threat to the globe and all this. But I think that there's a lot of things that take place that are just bad public policy. And, right now, I mean, the Keystone cancellation had nothing to do with the environment. It had everything to do with politics. We are since the cancellation of Keystone, Canada is shipping more oil to the United States than it was before, and more than it would have under the Keystone. But it's all going by rail, which is much more dangerous, much more environmentally unfriendly. And as you say, I mean, part of the difficulty with all of this is allowing a Russian pipeline to go on, while at the same time canceling a Canadian one. I mean, it doesn't make any sense. And we're, the environmentalists right now are so focused on the supply as opposed to the consumption. I mean, we're going to be using oil and fossil fuels for the next, I don't know whether you want to say 20 years, 30 years, 40 years, it doesn't matter. The question really is, are we going to be using those fossil fuels from democratic countries who care about the environment, who are reducing their emissions, or are we going to leave it up to the Russias and the Venezuelans of the world who don't care one whit about any of that? And I think part of all of this, I think, is that we've lived through an awful lot of years of prosperity and low interest rates and low inflation. And my prediction is that isn't going to last for very much longer. And as we run into economic headwinds over the next 2 or 3 years, a lot of these issues are going to come back on the table where people start saying, okay, yes, we need to make significant moves in terms of greening, in terms of getting to zero emissions, but let's not be silly about it. Let's not leave the economic cards all in the hands of those who are frankly our enemies. And I just hope we get to that sooner rather than later, because right now the discussion is not even rational. It's kind of, it's not a healthy discussion.
And just, we know it's infeasible to just go immediately to renewables, right? I mean, we've seen examples of Japan trying to do that after the Fukushima disaster. What did they do? They built coal-fired plants, right? Yeah. Germany tried to do the same thing, and they've given Russia coercive power over Germany's economy, by over-reliance on Russian oil and gas. And of course, the biggest reduction in greenhouse gas emissions ever, man-made greenhouse gas emissions, carbon emissions, was really the availability of cheap natural gas in the United States, right? Yeah. And so really, I think LNG as a liquefied natural gas as a bridge, nuclear power, these are issues that should be central, foundational to the climate issue. But those who are on the extreme of the climate issue actually are forswearing these essential elements of the solution. Any thoughts on that in terms of how do you think about a energy policy that helps fulfill climate-related goals, but also doesn't pose this kind of false dilemma between economic growth and lifting people out of poverty associated with energy availability and a climate disaster, right?
Well, I mean, we were having this debate when I was in the government, when I was ambassador, and I had come back to Ottawa to have some discussions, and one of the political aides to the energy minister was saying, all we need to have in terms of getting to net zero is political leadership And like was shown in the province of Ontario when they got rid of coal. And I said, well, I happened to be in the Premier's office at the time. And I can tell you that the reason that we were able to get rid of coal over a decade was because 50% of our baseload power was being generated by nuclear. That nuclear power you hate so much. And she was one of these huge anti-nuke people. And you know, there was not much comeback from that. But you know, I worked with the oil and gas industry many years ago when the federal government in Canada had a really anti-oil policy. And one of the things we found, I owned a public opinion research firm, and one of the things that we found was, you know, if it was the oil and gas industry out advocating for a particular position, it made their position worse because people didn't understand the issues. And we did a 3-year-long advertising campaign, and the tagline to it was, "Energy solutions begin with understanding." And all we did was provide facts. And over time, what happened is that allowed for options to be discussed and advocacy. And I think part of the problem, and you articulated it correctly, is that the two sides are extreme. On the one side, you had the climate deniers who say, this is not a problem, what are you doing? And on the other side, it's kind of stop all, leave it in the ground people. And the middle ground, which is, you know, can't we find a way to reduce our emissions and reward those who do so and penalize those who don't, but not go to the extremes of either side? And I think you're starting to see, I mean, I saw that the Business Council in the US and the oil and gas industry and others have recommended a carbon pricing as being a way to have a market-based way to deal with this. But I totally agree with you is that what's happening is the extremes are allowing our adversaries to get a leg up on us, and it's going to cost us in the long run.
You know, and among those adversaries is China, and of course, right, this is a problem. You know, carbon emissions don't respect, you know, countries' borders, no. Right? And so, you know, China is building 50 to 70 coal-fired plants globally a year. Making false pledges, you know, to do better. I think I assume that they're false based on the track record, that they'll do better in the future and so forth. And so, but how do you see the competition with China in the energy realm, and are we kind of shooting ourselves in the foot there in terms of our ability to compete with, you know, with what is a growing threat to the world associated with China's promotion of this authoritarian mercantilist model? I mean, do you think some of these policies are counterproductive in terms of that geostrategic competition as well?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, there have been some discussions that I've heard around, you know, you talked about trade policy, is that if we implement some kind of carbon pricing on the production, the manufacturing of goods in North America, why would we allow goods into North America from countries that don't care about, how much carbon they're using? And so I think that the next sort of trade tensions in the world are going to be between those of us who have chosen one way or the other to limit fossil fuels in all aspects of our lives, and those who don't care about it and will be able to manufacture goods at a lower price because they don't have, they're getting the cheapest alternative without worrying about the environment, you know. And I expect this issue is going to become, you know, front and center over the next few years. And I don't know how we resolve it, but this has to do with, you know, the whole look at the resiliency and the integrity and the security of our supply chain in so many things. So it's going to be an interesting debate.
And, you know, how's Canada thinking about that, David? Supply chain resilience. You know, of course, all of us woke up to the dangers associated with over relying on China for for PPE during the COVID crisis, obviously, but now there's renewed concern over other critical supply chains like pharmaceuticals, but then especially now renewable energy sources, right? Battery manufacturing, access to rare earths. I mean, we may wind up trading our 1970s over reliance on the Middle East for energy sources for a 2020s, 2030s period of over reliance on China. So, how do you think about supply chains and the adjustments that are like starting to be made? It seems like internationally.
Yeah, they are, and I think that the only thing that I'm worried about is that people use the security argument to become more protectionist, and I think that's a real danger. I mean, in the early days of COVID, when we were trying to get PPE in Canada, and President Trump invoked the whatever it is, the national, it wasn't 232, but it was the Defense Production Act to ban a company from exporting PPE to Canada. And then we kind of reminded the administration that actually 25% of the material that was in the PPEs that was being manufactured in Minnesota actually came from Nanaimo, BC. And we didn't have to ship that stuff anymore if we didn't want it. So all of a sudden there was kind of oh gosh, maybe, we should collaborate a little bit more. So what I think we should be looking at is making sure that we aren't too reliant on China and other countries that we can't trust for critical materials. And we initiated, there was a lot of collaboration back when I was ambassador with US security officials about rare earths and critical minerals and all that kind of stuff. And I think we need to do more of that. I think we need to realize that if we're going to be able to stand up to these bad actors, we're going to have to collaborate a lot more and not allow narrow protectionism in the name of security to get in the way of building things that are good for both. It's kind of, we got to really get back to the 1 + 1 = 3 rather than, just trying to do it for ourselves.
Well, Dave, you played a central role in the renegotiation, redrafting of NAFTA, which became the USMCA trade deal. Anything you'd like to share about that process, and then how that has informed your thoughts about North American trade and the potential associated with it? Maybe also related, right, to the adjustment of supply chains and the need for efficiency, but also resilience in those supply chains.
Yeah, I mean, I think we have a really good foundation in the USMCA. It was a difficult negotiation, but at the end of the day, I think it worked out extremely well. And frankly, and I've said this, publicly before, I wouldn't want to be trying to negotiate the USMCA with the Democrats in power, because President Trump, while he was unpredictable in many ways, you kind of knew what you needed to do in order to get an agreement, which was to make him look good. That was
well, and then you also had Bob Lighthizer, right? Who's
a pro,
but it's just phenomenal, right?
No, he's smart and savvy and everything else, and so we were able to come up with things that made sense for everybody, and everybody had to put a little bit of water in their wine and all that kind of stuff. But the reality is, it was a good agreement, and I think it's a good foundation. But if you look at, okay, how do we leverage that base agreement into something that is good for all of us? You kind of, first of all, I mean, looking at Mexico, and you say, a lot of the production that takes place in the Far East and in China in particular, Mexico could produce a lot of those goods. I mean, they're getting their labor is cheaper, frankly. I mean, but they're becoming more sophisticated in terms of their technology and their manufacturing capabilities. And I think that, when you look at the immigration problem, the issue is that the reason that a lot of the Mexicans and Central Americans try to come to the United States is because they have no hope in their own countries. Well, it's in our interest to create economic opportunities for those people, because it'll take a lot of pressure off of us, and we will become less reliant on China for a lot of the things that we purchase. So I just think that, the USMCA is a great foundation, but we need to think about building on it to ensure Canada's prosperity, United States prosperity, and Mexican prosperity. And then we need to think about what we're going to do in terms of Central and South America in addition to that. I mean, I think about the hemisphere as being a place that we've got to spend a lot more time worrying about than we have before.
Yeah, I think we took the positive trends in the Western Hemisphere for granted a little bit, and it's an area that we worked on closely with you and the Canadian government. I think we worked together very well within the Organization of American States, for example, on issues like Venezuela and what to do about Cuba. But of course, we're talking about NAFTA, and Mexico is kind of a problem these days, right? In connection with the philosophy that underpins President Lopez Obrador's policies, right? He's very skeptical of business, and he's skeptical of really supporting economic growth rather than a statist approach to the economy. How do you see his policies? Do you see them as an obstacle? And what do you think the prospects are? I think some businesses think, hey, this is kind of unpredictable, in terms of the Mexican government, and they're holding back maybe on investments that might allow us to really meet the potential of the USMCA.
Yeah, I think that's fair, and I know of some Canadian companies who have historically invested in Mexico and been burned by seemingly irrational changes in policy and things like that. On the other hand, there are some that have been successful and continue to be optimistic about Mexico. I think, one of the things that I've learned over the years is that business can deal with all sorts of regulations and legislation, but they can't deal with is uncertainty. And I think that Lopez Obrador's has created a lot of uncertainty in Mexico, but frankly, canceling pipelines and changing FERC regulations and doing things that completely change policy in the United States and in Canada. We've done the same thing here. I think is going to hold back investment in all three countries. And I think they happen to just be sort of the worst example of it. But stability, when you're making huge financial commitments for the long term, the last thing you need is to have uncertain regulatory or challenges. The foundation of our prosperity in the Western world is the rule of law. And sometimes you look at it and say, well, a lot of the politicians these days don't seem to believe in the rule of law, and it's not just confined to Mexico.
Yeah. And of course, this does help China, right? Who benefits whenever they can have coercive power over us. Sure. Based on overdependence economically. You've had China engage in hostage taking, essentially with Michael Kovrig and Michael Spavor, who are now going in their third year of imprisonment in China without any due process, without any legitimate cause. How do you think about reducing Canada's, North America's reliance on China? And are you concerned about that Canada might be like the next Australia, right? Because of the way that the Canadian economy is intertwined with the Chinese economy. Do you see Canada susceptible to that kind of coercion? And what can we do to diminish that over-reliance maybe on China as a market, or as an investor back into our economies?
Yeah, I don't think there's any question that, in some respects, well, we always talk about the Chinese being strategic. Sometimes they're just bullies. And what would have been strategic, in my view, would have been when the United States was being so, having difficulties with China, would have been for China to, be nice to Canada, right, and to make more investments and to have more of our goods sold into them. And yet, what they've done in 3 years by putting the two Michaels in jail for no reason whatsoever is just completely turn Canadians into being anti-China and hostile. Now we've still got, a lot of trade relations, particularly in agriculture and lobster and things like that. But we're still in a situation where 72% of our exports go to the United States of America. So, we do need to diversify our trade in many, many respects. And certainly what's happening now as is happening in the United States is that any new investment, we used to screen them by the size. So if it was over $1 billion, we'd review it. But there's now a much lower test because the Chinese were coming in and taking over small technology companies that had really good technology. And now, as in the United States, we're screening them for security purposes, not just the size of the investment. So we're a long way from being sophisticated about this, but again, it's another area where Canada and the United States should be cooperating and collaborating a lot more, just in terms of intelligence and information about what they're trying to do and which companies and which universities they're working with too. I mean, the university sector in our country, as in yours, has been, very much working with the Chinese over the past decade or so in some pretty sensitive areas.
And obviously we have to work on this together, right? It's clear. I mean, I'm just thinking of this recent case of it was a Chinese Canadian researcher who was doing research with a grant from the U.S. National Institute of Health, and was engaged in a major espionage campaign.
Yeah.
And so I remember talking to my Canadian counterpart, Daniel in 2017 about this. I think this is about when Canada rolled out the new sort of what we would call CFIUS, the Committee on Financial Investment in the United States. And we worked on that together in the hope, and I hope this is the case still, that we would work together in a transparent manner, across the United States and Canada. Now there's, of course, more scrutiny on investments, U.S. investments in Chinese companies, right? And you saw the Biden administration blacklisted it. This come out recently, and there's a recognition, that we at least maybe should not be complicit, right, in financing companies that are perfecting their technologically, enabled Orwellian police state, or companies that are engaged in use of slave labor, or developing the most advanced defense capabilities. Right. Is that happening in Canada as well now? More of a scrutiny about really Canadian investments back into China?
Yeah, but not as much. It's not that hasn't been the big debate. It's been more. I mean, where the discussion has been is it's been about the investment in Canada, about as I said, funding of research and also our dependence, certainly in certain sectors, on trade issues. There hasn't been as much of what are the Canadian companies doing in terms of investing in China, although there's a fair bit of that's going on. So, but I mean, you and I have talked about this before, and I we are moving into quite a new geopolitical arena. And we continue to try to cling to the institutions of the past, and some of them are still worth preserving. But you saw this past week with some relaxation of trade tensions between the United States and the EU, although I suspect that had more to do with Boeing's diminished clout in Washington than it did any trade generosity on the part of the Biden administration. And you've got NATO with the Turkish issue and the Polish issue and a variety of things. And I don't think we've adjusted our sort of mentality or our approach to what is going to happen. I know they did discuss, the China issue at the G7 and all this kind of stuff. And but whatever's in the end of the G7 press release doesn't necessarily mean that everybody's going to be acting in concert. I mean, so I don't know where it's all going to go, but I think that we're going to have to really, really work hard at building back alliances around, people who share the same values about democracy and about, privacy and about, civility and decency and the rule of law. And I think we've let that slip, and we've kind of, and they have essentially outmaneuvered us in a lot of ways. And that whole, Belt and Road Initiative in terms of the, putting infrastructure in around the world and having people dependent on them. Finally, I think we're starting to realize what's going on, but I don't think we've had an adequate response yet.
No. And, you mentioned Europe and the importance for us to work together with allies and partners rather than just have a, sort of better atmosphere at cocktail parties, right? We have to actually get things done together. I think that applies to our hemisphere as well, right? Where we see some really interesting competitions going on between political extremes, right? In countries like Ecuador and Bolivia, the trend seems to be in the right direction, right? Back toward democratic governments and free market economic systems. But then you see it doubling down on authoritarianism, right? When in Venezuela, Nicaragua, in Cuba, certainly, where the Cuban army, despite Castro not being in power, the Cuban army is still in charge. And then you see a swing kind of toward the left and deep skepticism about free market economic systems in Chile, for example, or in Colombia now, and Argentina in the past, in the last election. How do you see the trends in terms of popular views toward free market economic systems and the alternative kind of statist model that's being promoted across our hemisphere in a way it seems like it's back to the future, right? We're going back to the same sort of debates and competitions that we saw play out in the 70s and 80s.
Yeah, and I feel really badly for some of the countries. I mean, you take a country like Colombia, which went through a horrible time for a long time and then kind of emerged out of it with a democratically elected government that was looking, and then all of a sudden, descended on by, 1 million plus Venezuelan refugees who were fleeing abject poverty and starvation in Venezuela, and their system simply can't cope with it. And so, you then, people look for quick answers. I don't know what the right answer is, but I do know, and we had some problems with the OAS and had to kind of think about putting together a group that was largely OAS, but didn't include everybody because the certain members would have voted against anything we wanted to do. Not mentioning any names, but the reality is, certainly from Canada's point of view, we've always thought about the United States, our relationship with the United States, and Mexico. And I think what's happened in the last 5 or 6 years, and maybe a little bit longer, is we've started to realize that the hemisphere itself is important. It's important in terms of drugs, in terms of human smuggling, in terms of a whole host of things. and the only way we're going to build a better relationship in the hemisphere is to find a way to help get rid of some of the poverty in these countries. And the challenge in doing that is the corruption that exists within the administration. So just giving the money doesn't actually, it just enriches a bunch of, leaders. So I don't know what the answer is, but we got to figure it out, because otherwise we're going to be constantly, having the Ortegas and the Maduros and everything else, causing their people problems, and as a result, causing us problems.
So, David, I've asked you some tough questions here, but I've got an even tougher one for you. We're in the midst of the Stanley Cup Finals, when this program airs, and but I want you to maybe make a prediction even further out, going to the Winter Olympics. And I wondered in particular if you have any inside knowledge about what the Canadian women's hockey team is doing to overcome, their defeat in that amazing match in the last Olympics, right? I think it went into three overtimes, and the U.S. team won, for the first time, I think, ever, and disrupted Canada's. I think it was a 24-year title as women's ice hockey victors. So, what are your predictions on women's hockey in the upcoming Winter Olympics?
Well, I think what we'd like to do is to put the U.S. women's hockey team in the same position as the U.S. men's hockey team was after 1960, which is, kind of the last time they won. It's kind of a little bit
1980, you're forgetting 1980.
Oh, well, yeah, okay. But the reality is that we occasionally want to be neighborly and make sure that you don't feel badly. So, but no, I think that we will reassert our dominance in women's hockey. I don't think there's any question about that. And it's really funny you raise hockey, because when I was ambassador and I used to talk to members of Congress and business people, as well as administration officials, and at a particularly tense time, I said to a member of the Senate, I said, we're Canadians, we're your best friends, your closest ally, we're very polite, we're nice people, we say sorry too often, but don't forget, we're hockey players, and so watch it. But no, it's I don't like to talk about hockey very much, because I'm from Toronto, and we don't play professional hockey in Toronto, apparently. So
I know you find it offensive, but I'm from Philadelphia, and I'm a huge Flyers fan. Disappointing season this year, but I'm still nostalgic for those good old Broad Street Bully days of the 1980s.
Well, I think I mentioned to you that my wife is a huge Chicago Blackhawks fan, and when the Blackhawks were playing the Flyers in the Stanley Cup, I took her down to Philadelphia, and we were on the subway going to the game, and she was wearing a Bobby Hull jersey. This is not the city of brotherly love when you're talking about somebody bragging about the Chicago Blackhawks and the Philadelphia Flyers. So they were kind of jostling her a bit, and one of the guys said, "Who's she?" And I said, "I don't know. I've never met her in my life. I don't know who she is." But we escaped anyway. But no, it's pretty intense.
Yeah, Philadelphia fans are enthusiastic, right? I think
yes,
enthusiastic.
Yes.
Hey, David, on behalf of the Hoover Institution, I can't thank you enough for joining us on Battlegrounds and helping us understand better crucial challenges and opportunities that we face internationally, and challenges and opportunities that are critical to building a better future for generations to come. So great to see you, and a real joy having you on this program.
Well, thanks very much, and thank you very much for your service to the United States and to peace and democracy during your whole career, and it's a privilege to have been able to get to know you, and look forward to visiting you in California when they open up the border, which is my current challenge. That's what I'm trying to persuade everybody to do right now. So, but thanks very much. I really appreciate it, and look forward to seeing you again soon.
I look forward to it too, David. Thanks again.
Battlegrounds is a production of the Hoover Institution, where we advance ideas that define a free society. For more information about our work, to hear more of our podcasts, or view our video content, please visit hoover.org.